Have you ever stood in your garden at the end of autumn and wondered why everything must come to a halt just when it is at its most beautiful? While looking at the tomato vines that still bear a few fruits, have you ever felt that this season will be over once the next hard frost arrives? Have you ever felt as though everything you spent months on since spring, sowing seeds, watering, weeding, and watching leaves, flowers, and fruits grow closes down in just a brief moment? While picking up vegetables at a store in the dead of winter, have you ever wondered why they don't taste as good as the ones harvested from your own garden? Haven't you believed that your garden is something that lives only for a few warm months and then sleeps for a long time thereafter? But is that really true? Is winter truly the end of the garden? Or have we simply been ending it too early for a long time? I believed that for a long time. For me, there were only two things in a garden, a beginning and an end. When spring came and the soil warmed up, the garden would start moving. When the first hard frost came, the garden would end. I accepted that idea as a matter of course for far too long. I thought surely everyone else was doing the same. Grow as well as possible during the warm season harvest, as much as possible during the summer, and after that, from the end of autumn onward, it becomes a period of quiet, blank space. I thought that was what a garden was. In other words, I viewed the garden as a task for the summer and did not see it as a system that supports the dining table throughout the year. However, at some point a small doubt arose regarding that idea. This is because I realized there are people who, while living in the same cold and in regions where frost comes in the same way, do not treat the garden as something that lasts only half a year. While many people were clearing their furrows, pulling up remaining plants and thinking, "This year's garden ends here," those people were preparing their tables for January, February, and March. They don't think about seeds only after spring returns. They had been asking a different question much earlier. What do they want to eat in the middle of winter? They were structuring their year by calculating backward from that question. What surprised me even more was that this approach was not merely an old custom. Materials from American universities and cooperative extension organizations explain that it is entirely possible to extend the harvest season from autumn into winter by selecting cold, hardy crops, correctly identifying the timing for sowing seeds, and protecting them with simple methods such as cold frames, covers, or mulch. Penn State and the University of Minnesota suggest that season extension is realistic even for home gardens, and that crops for autumn and winter can be sown during the midsummer period. NC State also states that cold frames become even more effective when placed in a direction that easily receives winter sunlight while avoiding cold winds. And I learned another moving fact. There are vegetables that do not just endure the cold, but actually improve in flavor after a frost. Chills are not always the enemy. For certain crops, they are rather an opportunity to deepen the flavor. It was then that I finally realized it wasn't that my garden lacked strength. What was lacking was a plan that looked ahead toward winter. What I want to talk about in this video is not about making the garden unnecessarily complex. It is about seeing the garden as a system that works through all four seasons. Spring has its role. Summer has its role. Autumn has its role, and winter also has its role. If you thought your garden only lived from late spring to early autumn, what you lack might not be vast land or expensive equipment. What is necessary is to change how you look at winter. Change begins there. If the difference lies not in the climate itself, but in how the planning is done, then the first thing to change is not the garden. What must be changed first is the mindset of how to view the entire year. For a long time, I thought it was enough to start planting once the soil warmed up in the spring. I believed that summer was the true gardening season, autumn was the time to harvest the remainder, and winter was just a long break spent waiting until the next spring. However, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this very way of thinking was shrinking the potential of my own garden. When you think of the warm season as the only main event for the garden, you end up ending the garden yourself, even while there is still time left to do more. In my old way of doing things, the beginning of the year always started with the same question. What should I plant this spring? This question sounds very natural, but when you make this question the starting point, the center of the plan is always spring, and the garden moves based on the mood or momentum of that moment, rather than what is truly needed. People who think about the garden through all 4 seasons start with a much different question. What do I want to eat in January, February, or March? The moment you switch to this question, the way the year is structured becomes completely different. When you start thinking by calculating backward from winter, the garden is no longer a series of impulsive tasks. It is no longer something where you plant everything at once in the spring harvest, all at once in the summer, and then stop for a long time. The garden transforms into a system where each season takes on a role while connecting food to the next season. There, I finally realized something very simple, yet important. A 4-season garden does not mean that every season looks the same. The garden in July and January does not need to be equally lush and green. It also does not mean that crops grow at the same speed in cold periods as they do in summer. It simply means that each season has its own work, and that work supports the next season. Spring has the role of preparing the soil and starting the movement of the first crops. Summer has the role of not only the joy of harvesting, but also starting preparations for autumn and winter. Autumn's role is not to end, but to extend the garden's work a little further. And winter has the role of receiving the things that live even in the cold and connecting what has been preserved to the dining table. When my perspective shifted to this, I also came to understand why there are people who do not feel that winter is the enemy. In fact, there are crops that prefer cool climates, and they show their strength in the chill rather than the heat. Materials from Penn State explain that by using season extension methods like cold frames or covers, it is possible to continue harvesting from autumn through winter, even in home gardens. The University of Minnesota also points out that many vegetables can be connected to an autumn harvest by sowing them from late June through August. In other words, the winter garden does not begin in winter. It has already begun during the time you are harvesting tomatoes and beans in midsummer. Visualizing the future dining table leads directly to the current sowing of seeds. The more I think about it, the more I feel that this approach is not just practical, but very human. This is because, rather than going against the flow of the soil and the seasons, it connects life while accepting what can be done in each season. The hot periods have freshness and momentum. The chills have the power to draw out sweetness. The cold seasons have a quiet joy in realizing the meaning of what has been prepared. When you start thinking about what you want to eat in January, the garden becomes more than just a hobby. It is a place to enjoy the appearance, but more than that, it becomes a living system that connects food from week to week and season to season. This is the foundation of the 4-season garden. Before considering which crops to choose or how to protect them, you must first accept that the beginning of the year is not spring. The year is connected like a ring, and no single part is the only main event. Once you are able to see it that way, what needs to be done next also becomes clear. To make the garden work harder, you do not necessarily need a vast amount of land. What is needed is smarter planting. And from here, it leads to the next important topic. Not planting a lot all at once, but creating a state where something is always growing in the garden by shifting the planting times bit by bit. After I began viewing the garden as a system that works throughout the year, I realized another major point. The issue was not just what to plant. How to plant was equally important. For a long time, I followed a very common practice. I would wait for the spring to warm up and then plant a large amount all at once on a single weekend. Tomatoes, lettuce, beans, and root vegetables. I would start as much as possible in one go and hope the garden would proceed smoothly from there. At first, that method looks very pleasant. A newly planted garden looks like a fresh start, and there is a sense of satisfaction in having accomplished a big task. However, as time passes, the weaknesses of that approach become clear. The lettuce all reaches its peak at the same time becoming old before it can all be eaten. The beans also yield a concentrated harvest for a short period, then suddenly leave the garden feeling empty. The garden is abundant for only a short while, followed by a long void. What I lacked was not the harvest volume. What I lacked was a continuous flow. That was when I truly understood the value of staggered planting for the first time. This is not a difficult technique. It is a way of thinking to operate a garden more realistically. Instead of planting everything at once, growing everything at once, and ending everything at once, you divide things into small batches and sow them in several stages. You plant so that the next wave follows behind what was sown first. American cooperative extension organizations introduce this concept as succession planting, and it is considered a very basic and effective method for extending the harvest period within a limited area. Materials, including those from Penn State, explain that this method is useful for maintaining a long, small harvest rather than creating a single peak of harvest. Since adopting this way of thinking, the impression of the garden has changed significantly. For example, it is easy to understand if you consider lettuce. If you sow everything on the same day, everything becomes just right during one short period. While a lot will appear on the dining table at once past that period, the quality drops sharply as the plants get damaged by heat or start bolting. However, if you sow one short row first, then another 2 or 3 weeks later, and another after that, the harvests connect like waves. By the time the first row is ready to eat, the next row is growing, and the one after that is waiting behind it. A state is created in the garden where there is always something that will soon be just right. It is the same with radishes. By sowing them little by little, about 10 days to 2 weeks apart, you can avoid the extreme cycle of pulling up too much at once and then having nothing afterward. Bush beans also have a much longer harvest period by sowing small batches at different times. The important thing here is creating a flow rather than strictly following exact numbers. Every garden has its own climate. The timing of frost, the intensity of heat, and the way the soil warms up all differ slightly. Therefore, additional sowing is not something you should simply copy from someone else's schedule. You need to look at the growing days of the crops, know the first frost date of your region, and think about how much space to leave between plantings so that gaps do not easily form. The University of Minnesota also advises that if you want to extend the harvest season, it is important to calculate the sowing time backward based on the local frost dates. In other words, a good garden is made not only of soil and seeds, but also of a schedule tailored to the time of your own land. I like this method. This is because it does not just increase the harvest, it gently changes the very feeling of living with a garden. A garden that produces a large amount all at once and ends all at once is certainly lively, but it is somewhat restless. However, a garden where the harvest continues little by little has a quiet richness that stays close to daily life. This week, the second row of lettuce is just right. Next week, the radishes will be ready. A little later, the next beans will start to be harvested. When there is such a flow, the work in the kitchen also becomes lighter. Cases of having too much to eat at once decrease, and you don't have to frantically chase after the peak flavor of the season. The garden stops being a place that explodes for just a moment and becomes a place that supports life bit by bit every week. However, after a while, I noticed the next thing. While staggered planting is very important, that alone does not make the garden work through all 4 seasons. This is a way to make the spring and summer gardens smarter. It can lengthen the harvest of the warm season and reduce gaps. But if you want to connect food until late autumn or early winter, you must face another important question. Isn't it necessary to start sowing seeds for the next cold season during the busy period of the summer harvest? It took me a long time to understand that. July and August are not just times to enjoy the harvest. They are also the gateway to entering the latter half of the year. If you miss that period, you end up missing the entire latter half of the garden. Thinking about it this way, staggering planting times makes the spring and summer garden very smart, but we come to realize that this alone will not reach the second half of the year. Through succession planting, we can smooth out the peaks of harvest and reduce periods of emptiness. However, if we truly want to connect our dining table to the end of autumn and the beginning of winter, we must pass through another important door. That door is July and August. For a long time, I considered this period simply the peak of summer. It was a time of being busy, harvesting tomatoes, beans, squash, and peppers, and I was fully occupied just enjoying the day-to-day bounty. I never imagined that hidden within that midsummer busyness was a sowing time so important that it dictates the dining table of late autumn and early winter of that year. But this is a major dividing line in the philosophy of a four-season garden. It is too late to start thinking about autumn vegetables after the air turns cold. Many of the crops we want to eat in the autumn do not start growing after it gets cool. They are sown during the hot period and then grow while riding the gradual changes in the season. The University of Minnesota advises that many vegetables for autumn harvest are sown from late June through July and into early August. In other words, the autumn garden does not begin in autumn. It has already begun right in the middle of summer. Once you realize this, the way you see July and August completely changes. It is the peak of summer, but at the same time, it is the foundation for creating the second half of the year. This is where crops that are highly compatible with the cold become useful. For example, there are cold hardy leafy greens, kale collards, spinach, and cool season lettuce. Furthermore, there is the root vegetable family. Crops like carrots, beets, and turnips show their true potential around the time the temperature drops. Materials from Penn State and Oregon State explain that some cool season crops convert a portion of their starches into sugars in response to low temperatures, which can make them taste better after a frost. When I learned this, even my view of frost changed. Previously, I thought of it as a signal of the end, but for certain crops, it was actually a sign that their most delicious period was approaching. Of course, sowing autumn and winter vegetables in midsummer also comes with difficulties. I think many people stumble here. The problem is not the crops themselves, but the conditions for sowing seeds. The soil in July and August is hot, dries out easily, and makes it difficult to maintain the stable moisture necessary for germination. Seeds that prefer cool seasons struggle precisely with this point. Simply sowing them on hot ground can result in uneven germination and sparse rows. That is exactly why experienced people prepare the environment for germination by watering thoroughly before sowing or lightly covering the surface to retain moisture. These techniques for protecting young seedlings and treatments for pushing the season further ahead are repeatedly introduced in American Extension materials as an important part of season extension. I really like the work of this period. This is because it is a time to act while thinking about life several months ahead, not just the harvest right in front of you. Placing ripe red tomatoes into a basket while sowing seeds for autumn spinach right nearby. Picking beans while preparing rows for carrots that will turn sweet in the winter. There is a very quiet and deep joy in that. The garden is no longer just a pleasure of this present moment. Today's labor stretches directly to the dining table of the future. Summer is a season of abundance, but that is not all it is. Summer is also a season for building a bridge to the next season. And once we reach this point, the next question naturally arises. Assuming the autumn and winter crops sown in midsummer have started to grow smoothly, how do we protect those lives in the true cold that is yet to come? How can the garden keep working deep into winter rather than stopping in late autumn? What shows great power from there onward are actually very simple tools. They are not large-scale facilities, yet their effects are surprisingly profound. What I want to look at next are the two most practical methods for that. As the crops sown for autumn and winter begin to grow smoothly, the next question naturally arises. As the night chills set in earnest from here on, how do we protect those crops? How can the garden keep working deep into winter rather than stopping in late autumn? Previously, I thought that realizing such a thing required a large greenhouse and cost a lot of money and effort. However, the more I learned, the more I realized it was actually the opposite. What is truly important for extending the season is not large-scale equipment, but using small, simple tricks at the right time and in the right way. Among them I felt the power of two in particular. One is the cold frame, the other is a thick straw covering for root vegetables. Hearing just the words, cold frame, it might sound like some special device, but in reality its mechanism is surprisingly simple. It is just a bottomless box with a transparent lid. It takes in the daylight and stores a little bit of warmth inside. It doesn't need electricity, nor is it a facility like a large greenhouse. It is like a small sunny spot placed on the ground. NC State explains that it is effective to place a cold frame facing south or southeast so it can catch the winter sunlight. Well, choose a place with good drainage and weaken the cold winds from the north. Penn State also cites the cold frame as a practical method for extending the harvest season in home gardens. By just being a little mindful of these conditions, the environment inside becomes much gentler than the outside, making it possible to keep crops alive even in the cold season. Moreover, the good thing about a cold frame is that it doesn't require special crops. It perfectly suits crops that are originally suited for cool climates. For example, leafy greens, like spinach, winter-oriented lettuce, mustard greens, and collards, as well as other relatively cold, hardy salad greens. Of course, winter is not a season for fast growth like summer. As the days grow shorter, growth naturally slows down. But the important thing here is that the goal is not merely to make them grow rapidly during the winter. You grow them to a certain degree during the autumn and protect that state inside the cold frame. By doing so, you can go out when necessary and pick fresh leaves each time. In other words, a cold frame turns the garden into a small storage house that preserves things alive right there on the spot. Rather than harvesting everything ahead of time, you receive just the amount you need while it remains in a living state. Once you know this feeling, it makes a very big difference. And if the cold frame is a reassuring tool for leafy greens, the reliable method for root vegetables is a thick covering of straw. Previously, I thought that root vegetables like carrots, beets, and turnips all had to be pulled up before the ground froze. But in reality, if the conditions are right, you can leave some of them in the soil and dig them up little by little to eat during the winter. Materials from Oregon State also advise that with proper protection, some winter-oriented vegetables and root vegetables can be harvested while being maintained in the field or soil. The important thing is to prevent the soil around the roots from freezing completely deep down. And what performs that role very well is straw. The method is surprisingly rustic. Before a hard freeze arrives, you pile straw thickly over the rows of carrots and beets. You don't just scatter it lightly. You give it enough thickness to truly work as insulation. That layer of straw protects the ground like a blanket, softening the sudden freezing of the soil beneath. However, what particularly impressed me was the trick of placing a board or a piece of old roofing material on top of that. It is a very simple thing, but the effect is huge. If rain or snow hits the straw directly, the straw gets heavy wet and compacted, easily losing its insulating power. Just by having a solid cover on top, the straw is more likely to stay dry and maintain a fluffy state. That difference can even determine whether or not you can dig into the soil in the dead of winter. I still clearly remember the first time I lifted that cover on a cold day, moved the straw aside, and dug out a still vibrant carrot from the soil. That felt different from simply taking out a preserved vegetable. For me, who had thought the garden stopped in winter, it was a moment of confirming with my own hands that the land had continued to work even during the winter. The beauty of these two methods is that neither turns the garden into something unnatural. Rather than drastically rebuilding it, just changing the way you protect it slightly extends the time the garden works. However, once we reach this point, another important fact becomes visible. Even if there are things you can receive directly from the garden in winter, that alone cannot support the entire year. To truly complete the four-season garden, the wisdom of preservation is needed to bridge the bounty of the highly productive seasons to the winter. However, as the amount of things that can be harvested directly from the winter garden using cold frames and thick straw coverings increases, another very important fact becomes visible. If you truly want to connect the bounty of the garden to the dining table throughout the year, what can be left alive in the field is not enough. A four-season garden is not made up solely of what is growing in the field. It is completed by the wisdom of carrying the abundance of the highly productive seasons into the seasons beyond. In other words, preservation is not an afterthought of gardening. It is the system for the latter half that makes the four-season garden work. After I realized this, the way the garden looked changed again. I began to think that the garden is not just a place to grow crops, but a place to structure a year's lifestyle. When the season is on your side, you fully receive its bounty, and then quietly pass that bounty onto the colder seasons. Because of that flow, the four-season garden continues effortlessly. Previously, I often thought about preservation at the very end. If I harvested too many tomatoes, only then would I think about making sauce or sharing them with someone. When I got more beans than I could eat, that was the first time I thought about how to save them. Only in years with a lot of apples did I come up with the idea of drying or boiling them. However, people who think in terms of a four-season garden do not operate in that order. Rather than thinking after the harvest begins, they think from the time they sow the seeds about what they will eat fresh and what they will pass on to the winter. When planting tomatoes, there is a vision of the portion to be eaten raw and the portion to be preserved. When planting cabbage, a part of it goes directly to the dining table, and a part becomes something to pickle. When growing potatoes, onions, or winter squash, they are conscious of the storage location even before the harvest. This difference in mindset is truly enormous. The garden does not just produce food, it becomes the very blueprint for a year's life. As for practical methods, there are broadly three paths for preservation. The first is water bath canning suited for high-acid foods. Fruits, jams, pickles, and some tomato products fall into this category. The second is pressure canning for low-acid foods. Many vegetables and meats cannot be safely preserved long-term without this method. The National Center for Home Food Preservation advises that safely preserving low-acid foods requires sufficiently high temperatures of around 240 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, which a regular boiling water bath cannot reach. This is not simply a matter of making things last longer. It is a fundamental issue concerning family food safety. The third is storage in a cool, dark, and relatively stable place. Potatoes, winter squash, onions, apples, and cabbage can maintain their quality for a while if conditions are right. Oregon State explains that a cool environment is crucial for potatoes, as temperatures that are too high will shorten their storage life. Since I started considering preservation as part of the garden's plan, the meaning of each and every row has become clearer to me than before. A row does not just answer what to eat this week. It also answers what to eat next month and during the cold period. The row of tomatoes is not only for summer salads, it also connects to the jars of sauce opened on cold nights. The row of carrots connects not just to a single autumn dish, but to the sweet winter harvest waiting under the straw. Winter squash is not just for the lively scenery of the harvest, it becomes an entity that supports the kitchen for weeks afterward. Looking at it this way, the garden ceases to be a place that is abundant for only a moment. It becomes part of a long flow connected to the kitchen, the dining table, and the pantry shelves. There might not be anything flashy about it, but there is a very deep sense of security. And I think this is the greatest lesson I received from the four-season garden. There are no dead months. There are simply months with different roles. There is a month to sow seeds. There is a month to do succession planting and create a flow. There is a month to cover for protection. There is a month to dig little by little from under the straw. There is a month to open the jars that have locked in the summer sun. In spring, there is the work of beginning. In summer, there is the work of growing while preparing for the next. In autumn, there is the work of extending the season and turning abundance into preservation. In winter, there is the work of receiving what remains alive and what has been saved. When you come to see the year as a ring like this, the question of, how much did I harvest this year, is no longer enough. How long will this garden sustain me? What kind of life do I want to build together with this garden? Such questions naturally grow. What I have talked about so far is not a difficult challenge aimed at a special lifestyle. Rather, it is the opposite. The concept of a four-season garden is a way of thinking to live more calmly, more smartly, and more reasonably. The garden is not beautiful only when it is lush and green. It is also beautiful when the carrots are quietly waiting under the thick straw. It is beautiful when leafy greens are living under the winter light inside a small, cold frame. There is also another kind of beauty when jars of preserved food, locking in the bounty of summer, are lined up in the kitchen. The four-season garden is not a method for working a lot and getting tired. It is a method for living more calmly by looking a little further ahead. It is perfectly fine to try adding just one more row of autumn/winter crops, or covering just one row of carrots with straw, or trying to preserve a portion of the harvest for the first time. A small step is enough. From that one step, the garden will come to support your life for much longer than before, and once you see that potential, you will surely never be able to go back to seeing the garden as something for only a few months.